Our top focus tonight on the News 9 Plus show is the voice of support coming in for the Indian economy from the International Monetary Fund or IMF. Guess what? IMF has called the Indian economy a quote-unquote star performer, saying that India has rebounded strongly from the COVID-19 pandemic and will be one of the biggest contributors to global growth going forward from the year 2024 onwards. So what does this mean? To understand that, I have two very special gentlemen joining me here in the studio. One is Mr. R. Sridharan, Editor International of the TV9 Network. Sri, thank you so much for taking time out to be with us. We also have my colleague and friend Karthik Malhotra joining us as well in the studio. Karthik, great to have you with us. I'm going to begin by asking Sri, IMF always talks about how India is the outlier, India is the shining star amidst global gloom. This is taking things a step forward. We're not just an outlier amidst global gloom. We will be contributing to 16% of global growth going forward.
Absolutely, Krishna, because I think if you look at the large economies, which is US and China, they are the two biggest economies in the world. US could be facing recession next year in the new year, largely because of Fed's own policies. And we have China, which is facing the consequences of its own past sins in terms of debt, an exploding property market, a workforce which is dwindling, an aging population. So these are all problems of China's own creation. So that leaves out only India as a very large economy, which in contrast over the last 10 years has actually spent a lot of its energy fixing the underpinnings of the economy. So we got a lot of the infrastructure right, we got a lot of our banking system right, the financial services, the digitalization. All these factors have now come together to give stability in economic growth. So that's essentially what IMF is hinting at when it says that India is going to be the engine driving the global growth.
All right, engine driving the global growth. We've heard those words before, but the word we haven't heard is star performer. Those are big words, isn't it?
It's interesting, Krishna, how the narrative actually has built over the last 1 year or so. I think around this time last year, we were talking about India being a bright spot by the same IMF, by similar growth projections. So I think India over the last 2 quarters, Q1 and Q2 of this financial year, has outperformed its own expectations as well. But the narrative has actually moved from India being a bright spot to now India being a star that is shining and outperforming everybody else, right? So I just feel like most projections, most analysts and most agencies, rating agencies or otherwise out there, somehow there is always this discrepancy in the growth projections. So while IMF still considers India to be a star performer, it is still pegging India's growth at only 6.3%. The RBI, which had taken a pessimistic view of India's growth for this financial year, has revised India's projection upwards from 6.5% to 7%. We are still talking about a 6.3% from IMF. And like Sri mentioned, I think India, in comparison to other large economies, be it Japan, be it Germany, which was the first country to really go into a full-fledged hard recession this financial year, and compared to US and China, India is definitely shining brighter. And hence the badge of star is definitely a great badge to have. But we are looking at a very different world right now. When China was firing on all cylinders pre-COVID, they were growing much faster than us. So with a slowdown in China, with talks of US perhaps slipping into recession, if not a recession, hoping for a soft landing in that global economic context, India's growth coming in at whatever 6% to 7% range is good news, but unfortunately that comparison is being made only when the rest of the world is slowing down.
All right, Sri, if someone were to say, India is a star performer in a class of duds, because what's happening was the fact that most economies are likely to be duds, plagued by so many issues. But the fact of the matter is this: India did very well right through the pandemic, and more importantly, India's recovery post the pandemic has been very good. Resounding is the word used by IMF.
Yes. So that's one of the things we did, I think we got right. We did not print too much money to deal with the COVID downswing. If you look at the SOPs which the Modi government gave out, these were, of course, there was a direct monetary stimulus as well, but a large part of the stimulus was in terms of incentives and tax waivers and rollover of credit, which doesn't actually inflate the balance sheet of the government. So that has helped us in retrospect. And that also allowed industry and consumer demand to bounce back faster. But Krishna, going back to this whole concept of star performer, we don't operate in an isolated environment, right? I mean, we are dependent. Both US and China are our two largest trading partners. US just took over as the largest now. Earlier it was China, before that was UAE. But the fact is, if our largest customers are suffering, that pain will definitely get translated to some extent to India, unless you can have the local, the consumer demand within the country pick up the slack. Now that's a big ask, especially if you talk about something like IT services. You know, that essentially comes from US and other parts of the world, largely US. So I think how much of India remains a star performer also depends on how things play out in 2024 on the global front, especially with the war going on in Ukraine and Russia, and Hamas and Israel conflict going on. So whether that is going to stoke any kind of inflationary pressures in the global market, especially around oil, we don't know. If that happens, then I think it's reasonable to expect that our growth will also take a hit.
All right. The other question I want to ask is, how do we read these messages coming in from global agencies like the IMF in a day and age like this? You know, when we're questioning ratings agencies and the kind of ratings they're giving to a country like India, are we supposed to be jubilant every single time the IMF has some nice words to talk about the Indian economy? Because we're doing well irrespective of who's saying what.
So Krishna, I think we live in an influencer-driven world, right? And there isn't a bigger influencer perhaps than IMF, or in another context, the World Bank, or even the Asian Development Bank, as well as the rating agencies.
Right.
While they all do their own homework, and especially I'm talking in the context of investments coming into India, I think a positive sort of green signal on India's report card, co-signed by the likes of IMF, is always, it has a tendency of good investments hoping to flow into the country. So IMF is also saying, and I think IMF is also basing its projection on the fact that India does need political stability. And it is political stability which is actually going to draw in capital and draw in investments into India. So while this report card is a good headline, and while the report card is good for overall the morale of the country and the morale of investors who are seriously considering India as an investment destination, but only on the basis of ratings by ratings agencies or excellent nouns being used by the likes of IMF, is not the only thing that's going to cut it for India's growth.
Sri, the only reason why I was asking this question is because there's questions being raised on the relevance of IMF and World Bank and what are these...
In economics, there is a concept of signaling. Okay. That's essentially what, RBI or any Federal Reserve or any central bank does around the world when they talk about what is the direction they're going to go. So signaling is an important thing, and we should take this as a signaling, basically to the larger world, saying that India is a stable country. We have political stability. We have got the underpinnings of the economy right. There are many things that are going right for the country. And unless something extraordinary happens around the world in terms of, let's say, some global event, I think it's safe to say that we are on a good trajectory going forward, Krishna.
Hopefully not another war, isn't it? Because I think the world has had enough of wars. We've had 2 of them already. So all things remaining same, India is poised to be the star performer. At least that we can get from the IMF, Karthik?
Definitely, Krishna. But again, there are certain aspects of the IMF report card on India which are important for India to examine. Okay. If not immediate priorities, I think what is
especially
important...
on the dividend of youth.
Absolutely.
Like workers,
so dividend of the youth, I think that is critical. And in fact, that is something that even Raghuram Rajan had mentioned 2 days ago in a very different context. But I think what is important for India right now is to realize that employment has to be top priority. Jobless growth is not something India can afford. And very simply put, I think the focus has to be on job creation in the formal sector. So IMF's own report on India suggests that while we have breached the pre-pandemic levels on employment data, but that employment generation or adding up of the workforce in the informal sector is something that we need to balance out with enough employment coming in the formal sector as well. But again, from what is happening in the whole world, with discretionary spending being cut by the US and definitely cut in far wider measures by China, US particularly, the IT sector becomes a direct sort of impacted sector in India. So the kind of growth projections that the IT sector had made on adding to the workflows have actually been reversed in the last 1 year or so. And that is something that India has to be very, very cognizant of. And add to that the startups. I think we have seen India's startups which had provided for a lot of formal employment, urban metro employment, we've
gig
seen
economy, for
2020,
example,
we've
yeah.
seen 2023 has been a year where we have lost many of those jobs, and the numbers are as high as about 28,000 or so. So I think jobless growth is something that India cannot afford. And while these headline numbers look great, it has to be in equal measure on the back of employment.
Any other red flags that you're seeing from IMF's report? One is, of course, the kind of growth that India needs to do, which is growth with jobs. Any other concerns top of your mind, Sri?
No, so one thing which the IMF sort of indicates, and which even we have been discussing on News9 Live as well, is the fact that some of the states have gone in the wrong direction in terms of their SOPs to electorate. So that is something we need to watch out for, because if the fiscal situation at the state level becomes worrisome, then that is going to be a challenge for India, because that is going to take money away from vital investment required in infrastructure, in social spending, and it's going to go into wasteful expenditure. And that's a big concern, especially at a time when we have the opportunity to actually accelerate our growth. We'll probably risk going back in a reverse direction, Krishna.
I'm going to be the angel's advocate, which is the opposite of the devil's advocate. We're talking so much about the US and concerns about demand coming from the US being important for India's IT industry, which is a mainstay of India's growth. Talks of a rate cut by the US Federal Reserve. Wall Street is lapping up. Wall Street is behaving as if there is going to be a rate cut sooner than later in 2024, and that's this providing a lot of optimism on Wall Street. How would you view this talk of a rate cut and the possibility of an IT revival in India by the second half of 2024?
So on the US rate cut, I think it's a wishful thinking on Wall Street's part, Krishna, because I don't think there's a case for a rate cut. When do you cut rate? When you feel that the economy is softening and things are going down south. But in US, numbers are still holding. Our economy is growing. I mean, employment, although the addition to employment is slowing, the fact that you're still creating a lot more jobs than you were doing previously. So I don't think there is going to be a rate cut. But yes, Fed has signaled it's going to hold the rate. In fact, on the contrary, there are expectations that the Fed might actually increase interest rates if the economy continues to accelerate. So that's the bigger worry, why the Fed may actually engineer a monetary policy that pushes the economy into recession. Okay. So that is a worry in the US. I don't think anyone's really talking about or expecting a real rate cut to come from the Fed. I'd be very surprised. So now coming back to the Indian IT industry, I think it's a function of how the overall US economy does. And while the economic growth in the US is an important factor, because that drives the demand for IT services from India, I think there are bigger disruptions at play when it comes to the IT industry, which is AI. A lot of your jobs and coding is going to get automated. So how does that impact, low-end coding in India? That's a big issue.
Right. And there's, in fact, talk of you can quantify the amount of money in terms of millions and trillions of dollars that AI can add to the Indian economy, isn't it? So even as we have, headwinds possible that Indian economy has to deal with, there are, opportunities for India to grow and grow faster than what people expected to.
So Krishna, I believe on AI, again, there are multiple numbers floating around, and just about a month ago, it was expected that by 2025, India's economy, $1 trillion worth of India's economy will be based on AI, or AI would add that much amount. These numbers kept getting revised. It is 1.85 trillion. Some estimates say it is going to be 2.5 trillion.
No one really knows.
I think nobody knows right now. AI is still a developing field, and nobody really can put a number to how much it will contribute. But I think one can very safely assume that while AI will take away perhaps some of the entry-level jobs, it is going to also generate some employment opportunities. And there are creators out there who can actually latch on to AI as a trend to create content, create code, create apps, services, delivery platforms, etc. using AI. So the frugal innovation in India could get an all new dimension with the advent of AI.
Okay.
So the point on that to note, which I think Karthik is trying to make, is that while the economy may still grow, don't bet on jobs getting created as much.
Okay.
So we may still have a situation where we're looking at jobless growth, economy is growing, but jobs aren't getting created that much.
That's not a situation anybody wants. Definitely not us in the studio, definitely not the people watching this broadcast for sure. But I'm afraid we've completely run out of time here on this particular story. I'm going to thank Karthik Malhotra and Mr. Ashridharan for taking time out to be with us here on the News9 Plus show.
News is now content. Just stream it. Download the world's first news OTT, News9 Plus, ahead of the curve.